Hey, it's Jordan. Delighted to be joined by Justine Barron. You are an independent journalist who has been featured all over the place, really. You've been in Rolling Stone, Real News, The Appeal, NPR, Miami Herald, to name a few. And you have been working for, almost a decade now on to get the truth out about the murder of Freddie Gray in Baltimore. There's been so many names that viewers tend to forget when the media stops covering these stories. But Freddie Gray, we remember the video that we were shown of him basically being, accosted, thrown in a paddy wagon. But you've been kind of working to get the truth out, which in your book, which is just out, everybody should definitely pick it up. They Killed Freddie Gray. There's the book cover there, The Anatomy of a Police Brutality Cover-Up. I haven't finished the whole thing. I've read through a bit, but I'm pretty, not a lot of things shock me, but I'm pretty shocked by the just brazenness of this cover-up. Let's kind of start from the beginning. Tell me, how'd you get involved in this story? Because, the media covers these types of stories, if you're lucky, for like a week or two, and then kind of moves on.
Right. So in 2016, I was blogging about true crime, kind of like everybody, sort of like a stereotype of a white creative woman interested in serial and all those cases. And some producers that were working with the Undisclosed podcast, which covered the Adnan Syed story and does Innocence Project type cases, contacted me and another writer, a journalist named Amelia McDonald Perry, and they asked us to look into Freddie Gray. And I had not been a journalist. I have a nonprofit background. I'm a writer. And what we started to uncover was that this cover-up was profound, and that the public, even though there was 2 years of coverage, protests, riots, press conferences, 4 trials, hearings, the truth had never come out. So that's how it got started. And that was a while ago. So we did a podcast series, but we didn't have what I have for the book. We had a theory based on a few witnesses, and we had deconstructed the lies, and we had some evidence that we had secured. But then a couple of years ago, somebody just came forward with everything. And I not only confirmed our theories in the podcast, which I can get into, but it showed how early most of the city's leaders knew what really happened and covered it up with this very complicated narrative.
Right. And obviously we're talking Baltimore, for anybody that, infamously watched The Wire. Kind of ground zero for corruption among many cities. So, people won't remember, but I mean, they kind of released like quite a lot of video in the name of transparency, but it was just like hours and hours for reporters to go through. Obviously, we have, reporters who are either not going to go through all that or don't have the instincts to tell if things have been manipulated. I wanted to read this part because it kind of spiked my interest in terms of just straight up manipulation. This is an excerpt from the book. City leaders debuted some closed-circuit television video from Freddie Gray's arrest during a major press conference on April 20th, one day after he died. We're going to show you the closed-circuit TV to the police department, Deputy Commissioner Jerry Rodriguez said, and I want you all to listen to what I'm about to say. It is our video that has been unedited, that is raw. We are not in the business of hiding facts. It took a minute or so for the video to load up, so Rodriguez made a light joke. Quote, "We have only the very best equipment." While the CCTV video was loading, a camera was filming the press conference stage where Mayor Stephanie Rawlings-Blake, Commissioner Anthony Batts, and Rodriguez whispered amongst themselves. The Baltimore Police Department was filming the press conference to upload to its YouTube page. The microphone on stage picked up the conversation, though not loudly enough for the media and the audience to notice. It was a hot mic moment. Quote, "Besides these 3, they can't be out there. Is that right?" Mayor Rawlings whispered to Rodriguez, "Yes, ma'am. What about the other 3? So that piqued my interest. Tell us about that and what your reporting found.
So for the first week, Freddie Gray lay in a coma. And the protests got bigger and bigger. They started from his community because the police wouldn't reveal anything. All that the public knew was that he had been arrested. He was screaming during his arrest, which people saw in viral videos. And that 45 minutes later, they found him in a coma at the police station. So the day after he dies, they hold this big press conference, in a different, like a huge, their formal setting, national media is there, and they unload everything in terms of their story. So they waited until he died because he was never going to be able to say that's not true and that's not true. And that this press conference has this moment where the three city leaders are whispering. And I don't think there's any way that you could look at that and not realizing that the truth is being covered up. So what they were talking about was not sharing all the video at that time. I have a good idea that what they were talking about was a camera that showed the van, speed past where he was being arrested and some officers searching the ground for something. He hadn't even run in that part of the, in that area. They were looking for something to pin on him because they didn't have an arrest.
And they were looking kind of like in a lot that was nowhere near where he was.
He hadn't run through that lot, and honestly, the public would never know about Freddie Gray if they had just put him in the van right away, because that's when Kevin Moore came out to start filming him screaming. So this is already evidence that here they are at this big press conference, and they tell the public about all of the van took this stop and that stop, and then it picked up another passenger, and we don't know how he died, but it must have happened while the van was in motion. There's no evidence of force. And then in the middle of this, they're just brazenly whispering about hiding evidence from the public and from the state's attorney's office at that point.
Right. And also your book talks about and reveals witnesses that were pretty close to the first stop where he was arrested, but they don't interview those witnesses.
Well, actually they did. So it was the first two stops are the key. So what happened was everybody saw him put in the van, all right? And a lot of the public thought, wow, he looks like he might have already been seriously injured there because he's screaming his head off and his legs are dragging, right? And so there's this clear video of him getting into the van. What our investigation discovered was that he wasn't actually, and the police and prosecutors said this too, he wasn't actually fatally injured there. Because you can see him moving his neck, he's speaking, and he's holding his own weight. However, he had been injured, and we know that because of witness statements. The van then went around the corner and took him out for what was called stop 2 of this crazy six-stop arrest. And that is where witnesses saw more brutality, and what we believe is the fatal brutality, because he was thrown headfirst into the van. So actually, police and prosecutors collected these witness statements from hours after the arrest. And that was what I recently uncovered, more recently for the book, was that they knew right away about a ton of force. It was just, beating, tasing, throwing him headfirst into the van. It was very aggressive. And then in that press conference that you quoted, you have the deputy saying, we're going to be transparent. There's no evidence of force. But they had a bunch of these statements already.
Right. And did you uncover, I don't know if the word's motive, but why they were so rough with Freddie Gray when...
Yeah. Well, he surrendered. Even the police said that. He got down on his stomach. It's a bit of a puzzle, but not really. There's a few things that I have that explains it. First of all, Freddie was known for being a jokester and kind of like he would talk back. And these are some aggressive cops involved in his arrest, because I have their IAD file, their internal affairs disciplinary files. So a couple of them have like very long records of just constantly brutalizing people or harassing or, so it's not really that surprising. But what I really think happened here, what I really think is the key, is that once he was harmed, he screamed loudly, likely from being tased, because as you know, tasers will cause anybody to scream their head off. Once he started screaming, I think that they responded by getting more aggressive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And, what's interesting to me, you look back at, OJ and a lot of these kind of must-see TV criminal cases. And you kind of get to know some of the district attorneys as like stars. And Marilyn Mosby, who was the DA there, she came out in front. I don't know the political scene in Baltimore, but she definitely got good media coverage for acting. But based on your book, it seems like she was involved with this conspiracy.
Well, her office, for sure,
Okay.
and, so by implication, her. Yeah, she really made a name for herself because it's a very complicated, layered story. Because it's not like she said, okay, well, we won't charge anyone. She charged 6 officers with really serious crimes: manslaughter, murder for the driver, assault, But none of them were accused of being forceful on Gray directly. So it was a very weird case, legally pretty unsound, like second-degree assault for not seat belting him or calling for medical attention. That's not actually assault in Maryland. You know what I mean? So it was a performance of sorts. The evidence shows that there was almost no investigation by their office. And in fact, after the trials ended, the lead prosecutors and Mosby herself were asked, did you rush this case? Because they had no convictions based on their story of like an injury happening while the van was moving. And they said, we didn't rush it. We had everything we needed from the officers' statements. So like, you have to think about that. Like, the officers are the defendants. You had everything you needed from what they said happened, right? So that's what's layered about it. Like, they built their narrative of the arrest around what the defendant said happened and then tried to blame them for it.
Mm-hmm. And, I find, obviously in my audience, a little bit, I've covered Flint extensively. I find, in a way, local media plays a part in suppressing the truth. You're independent. It's not like you have the resources of the New York Times behind you. Can you kind of talk about, if you were able to find this, I'm sure you had some research help, but it was mostly you. Yeah. If you were able to find, manipulation of videotape, of the CCTV footage, a conspiracy, I assume you were submitting this to local outlets in the Baltimore, DC area. Were they not investigating themselves? Were they not interested in this? Are they, we do know there's a problem with just media just regurgitating what police say in this country.
So that part for sure. And some like relationships, my book highlights certain relationships between reporters and people. What happened was we started to get new evidence for the podcast, and we reached out to Baltimore reporters, and they either didn't respond or got hostile. It was wild. It's been a very long, strange journey between me and Baltimore media, both with this case and with other stories that I've covered. It is a very gatekeepy town in terms of the facts and the truth. They're very protective of their reporting. Even for the book, I reached out to lots of cops, and I got interviews with some people involved in the case on and off the record, or they would say, no, thank you, ma'am. Media, I reached out to the local media, and it was just like war. They were so aggressive, and it's like, you covered this case. Some of them made their careers, got Pulitzer nominations, questionable nominations in my opinion, based on their reporting. And you don't want to know what happened. You don't want to see like an interview with the lieutenant. You don't want to see that because you haven't seen it because they didn't play it in court. And they should have played it, but they didn't. So you don't want to see that. So it's like very weird and keeps me up at night and baffles me. That whole there's a chapter on the media in my book and quite a lot of
that's part of why I asked, because in my case, I found that you get a hostility almost to the point of, I don't know if it's that they feel like, this freelancer is trying to show us up, or they feel like you don't have, you're not on the meritocracy rung, like you're not with a big name, so we shouldn't trust, your reporting. What did you can't know for sure, but what did you think that hostility was about? Did they just kind of want the current narrative to remain, or Were they just too invested in, you are trying to publish this during the era of Trump, when so many important stories kind of get, lost in the shuffle?
Definitely the national media that had been very involved in this case had just kind of moved on. So there were some like CNN reporters and stuff that covered it a lot. And then they were just like, okay, great, keep me posted, but they weren't interested because they moved on. The local reporters didn't move on. The hostility, I think, it's all the things you mentioned, but also they knew that we were going to, for the podcast, they knew, I asked tough questions of reporters. Like, why did you write it this way? Did you think about this possibility? Why weren't you more interested in witness statements? So once you do that, they're very nervous people. And yes, I think, and in some cases, there were unholy alliances between powerful people in Baltimore and powerful journalists, where it was helping, literally. I'm going to get in trouble for that one, but that's what happened.
Hey, it's a double-edged sword. You try to get media attention on your book, but you got to be honest about the media too.
Yeah. I haven't made friends, and I'm like shocked there's any attention now for the book, because it's been like a nonstop struggle. I'm surprised I got to write it. I'm surprised I've gotten this, because I just thought Amelia and I would go to our graves without the public learning,
Right. And could you kind of talk about, obviously there's a pretty thin line between politicians, police, clearly we talked about the police's role in this. Your book talks about the mayor too, Stephanie Rawlings-Blake, who I think is now like a Biden person. I don't know what her role is.
Yeah,
but,
she was Bloomberg PR person. Yeah.
Yeah, Elijah Cummings, when he was alive, obviously represented Maryland, some others. Did you find anything on, not that politicians were directly involved, but
sure.
Were they involved in, any of the cover-up?
Certainly the mayor, not just her whispering, but at the same press conference, she sort of interrupted some conversation that was going on with the commissioner and said, listen, we have to be clear. It's obvious that whatever happened in the van and there's no cameras. So she really defined what would be the narrative going forward. Like, she went out and said it. We're not going to talk about witnesses anymore or his arrest. It's going to be an injury that mysteriously happened in the van and we'll never know. So she was very involved in all of that, clearly, like out in the open. Governor Hogan, this is kind of funny. Governor Larry Hogan has spent like the last 5 or 6 years talking about Marilyn Mosby like she was an enemy and she handled this case so badly. But in reality, like, he helped her rush the autopsy, because all of these political leaders just wanted to stop the protests. And that's what the charges were. People think these charges were this radical moment, which is it's like all liberal politics, right? It was supposedly this like radical moment. We're going to take on the police. Stephanie Rawlings-Blake said something like 3 Black women are going to solve this, meaning herself, Mosby, and Lynch, the attorney general. So the feds are involved too, by the way, another story. They played a huge role in covering this up. But so it was like this powerful radical moment, but it was actually manufacturing consent, because once they filed the charges, the public was like, oh, okay, we can stop protesting. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? It's so
absolutely. Yeah, it's try to change the headlines to positive while the city's burning. It's interesting you say that, because nationally, Larry Hogan, he's not the governor anymore, but he's on CNN and all these channels now. They make him out to be, some patron saint of normal conservatism. But, based on your reporting, he was kind of involved in trying to sweep this under the rug.
It was a real red-blue alliance.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you remind folks, I don't know, if you got to speak with Freddie's family, but 25-year-old, young, like so many of these Black men murdered. Can you kind of talk about what you learned about, Freddie during your reporting, his family, their fight for the truth?
So there is a reason that he became a symbol beyond just the coincidence of a viral video in the moment of Black Lives Matter. He was like a big deal in his community. He was a small-time drug dealer, nonviolent, never arrested even with a gun or a knife before that last one. So that's suspicious. But yeah, he was beloved. He was like the town lovable jokester, good guy. Even the older witnesses, like older people in the community who complain about drug dealing, in their neighborhood, knew him to be someone who always asked if they needed help and would do things for them. He was lovable. He was supposedly hilarious. Like, someone said he could have been on SNL one day, So a real and it shouldn't matter that he was just this great guy. We should care anyway, of course, but that is what the truth of this person and why the community, all the protests started with them. Like his neighbors marched to the police station and just started screaming at the doors of the police station because it was like, why did you have to kill this guy? He's so harmless, He grew up very poor and he had lead paint poisoning, and that became kind of a narrative. I think it was there was like a conservative take on him was that he was like this hardened criminal based on this ridiculous long list of arrests, most of which were thrown out or nonsense, like rolling dice, standing near someone, whatever. So a lot of his arrests had been thrown out, but that was the conservative portrayal. There was a liberal portrayal in media of him that I think was just as harmful, which was that he was just, forever doomed by lead paint poisoning. Like literally doomed was a word that was used for his life, or that it was inevitable that he was going to die. And there was a portrayal of him that was far more like physically and cognitively disabled than he actually was, which is reminding me of the Blind Side story happening now. Like he had lead paint poisoning and he had ADHD, which wasn't talked about. But beyond that, he wasn't the pathetic character that the liberal media made out, if that makes sense. It was a big story, like how the lead paint poisoning was, and it was really offensive, like as a disabled person, it's like offensive to portray lead paint poisoning in that way, as if nobody has a life beyond that,
Absolutely.
And it took pressure off the police because it was sorry, I go on.
No, that's great. Last question. I mean, you might be a little jaded based on your reporting, but based on, this is a capital C cover-up.
Yeah.
Based on your reporting, do you have a lot of hope for, the next, unfortunately, murder we see, whether it's a circumstance like Freddie Gray or George Floyd, who, remember, they put out a BS statement at first that it was a medical incident, that, we should trust the police to investigate themselves?
Oh, no hope. No, I have no hope. I'm sorry. Even with the George Floyd, it looked like it got better, but there's like 1,000 or more of these killings a year.
Right.
A few bubble to the surface, and then there's this performance of reform. Usually the same kind of policing institutions perform reform, and all it does is continue to legitimize the constant abuse and criminalization of being poor and Black, basically.
Right. Absolutely. And yeah, I would really encourage folks, there's a lot of books out there, most of them about Trump, but it's really rare that you get a full throttle reported piece about the anatomy of a cover-up, which this is, particularly adding components of, indirectly the media's involvement. That's very, very important because in my experiences, perhaps yours as well, the media, whether intentional or not, is often complicit in allowing these injustices to stand, but by not doing the hard work, shoe leather, reporting, or kind of reporting, kind of up until the line, but they don't want to go any further. So, yeah, thank you. Because this is not a story often that, is sexy or goes viral, but it's important.
Thank you so much for having me, and keep up your amazing work.
Thank you.